freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. Over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my own grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
The Declaration of Independence defined the promise of America, freedom and equality for all. The words rang hollow, however, for the millions of African Americans held in slavery prior to the Civil War, and were later denied political, economic, educational, and social equality by unjust laws and social customs. Although American slaves were emancipated as a result of the Civil War, and were then granted basic civil rights through the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, African Americans were segregated and oppressed by the white Americans. African American citizens had been battling racial oppression for centuries, and the Civil Rights Movement finally gave them a voice. The focus of the Civil Rights Movement was to end racial segregation and discrimination in the United States. It was not until the 1950s that African Americans were finally fighting the laws that prevented them from being treated equally. As the movement progressed, many people emerged as leaders to inspire other peoples to fight for their same cause. Three of these leaders include Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr., whom were all slaughtered for their beliefs. Medgar Evers was one of the first influential men to be assassinated during the Civil Rights Movement. After graduating from Alcorn College in 1952, Evers became heavily involved with the Regional Council of Negro Leadership. He also became interested in the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He volunteered to help with integrating schools. He was soon recognized for his work, and then later became the first field secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi. He recruited new members and continued to organize voter registration efforts, while also boycotting white-owned companies that practiced discrimination. Evers soon became very well known in his community. This caused him to be a target for those who opposed him. He received numerous death threats over the years, and finally one of those death threats became a reality.
15 minutes past midnight, Evers got out of his car beside his home in a Negro residential area. In a vacant lot about 40 yards away, a sniper fired a single shot from a high-powered rifle at Evers' silhouette. The bullet hit him in the back, crashed through his body, through a window into the house. He died within an hour at a Jackson hospital. City detectives believe the fatal shot was fired from this sweet gum tree. They have found a rifle in the bushes which they think is the murder weapon. They say they also have other clues. Mayor Allen Thompson cut short a Florida vacation and rushed back to City Hall, where he made this statement.
The City of Jackson offers $5,000 reward to anyone who gives evidence leading to the arrest and the conviction of the guilty.
In the Negro community, the mood is sullen anger and a desire for revenge.
Now, for many of us who've gone overseas, fought for this country, fought for Mississippi, we fought for Alabama, we fought for North Carolina, we fought for Illinois, and we fought for every state in this union. Now, we're going to stay here and see that the things that the mayor has said become a reality.
This event, this tragic occurrence, should cause all persons of goodwill to be aroused and should cause them to be more determined than ever before to break down all of the barriers of racial segregation and discrimination.
After the news of his death, people in the local area rioted. More than 150 arrests were made that night. Soon after, the FBI conducted a search and came up with Byron De La Beckwith as the main suspect. Beckwith was the founder of Mississippi's White Citizen Council, a group for white segregationists. Despite Beckwith denying that he assassinated Evers, a rifle was found not too far away from the crime scene with his fingerprints on the scope. On top of that, multiple witnesses saw him on the scene. After 2 long trials, Beckwith was set free after 2 all-white juries judged his case. It was not until more than 20 years later that Beckwith's innocence was questioned. In December 1990, Beckwith was again indicted for the murder of Medgar Evers. After a number of appeals, the Mississippi Supreme Court finally ruled in favor of the 3rd trial in April of 1993. 10 months later, testimony began before a racially mixed jury of 8 blacks and 4 whites in February 1994. Nearly 31 years after Evers' death, Beckwith was convicted and sentenced to a life in prison. He died in January 2001 at the age of 80.
One white man named Lincoln supposedly fought the Civil War to solve the race problem, and the problem is still here. Another white man named Lincoln, again the same white man, issued the Emancipation Proclamation to solve the race problem, and the problem is still here. Some more white liberals came along with the 13th, 14th, and 5th Amendments, which were supposed to solve the race problem. The problem is still here. 9 years ago, 9 more white liberals, so-called, came up with what they call a Supreme Court desegregation decision, and the problem is still here. And then another white man named Kennedy came along running for president and told Negroes what all he was going to do for them if they voted for him, and they voted for him 80%. He's been in office now for 3 years, and the problem is still here. When police dogs were biting black women and black children and black babies in Birmingham, Alabama, that Kennedy talked about what he couldn't do because no federal law had been violated. And as soon as the Negroes exploded and began to protect themselves and got the best of the crackers in Birmingham, then Kennedy sent for the troops, and there was no, he didn't have any new law. When he sent for the troops when the Negroes erupted, than he had at the time when whites were erupting. So we are within our rights and with justice, with justification, when we express doubt concerning the ability of the white man to solve our problem, and also when we express doubt concerning his integrity, concerning his sincerity, because you will have to confess that the problem has been around here for a long time, and whites have been saying the same thing about it for the past 100 years, and it's no nearer a solution today than it was 100 years ago.
Malcolm X was an African-American nationalist and religious leader during the Civil Rights Movement. However, he was not the first to be assassinated in his family for having the same beliefs. His father, James Earl Little, was murdered by a white supremacist group for his controversial sermons. His father's death was one of the reasons that X started to rebel. By the time he turned 21, X had dropped out of high school and became a felon. He was known as a drug user and a petty criminal. He was finally arrested when he was 21 for attempted burglary. While in prison, X met a member of the Nation of Islam, or the Black Muslims, who convinced him that white people were the enemy. After release from prison, he started to recruit members to join the Black Muslims. Malcolm X started to increasingly get more violent over the years. He wanted African Americans to take control, and he insisted that whites could not get better. X insisted that they should not integrate, but instead get their own land to reform. Although X was for the liberation of the African Americans, like Martin Luther King Jr., he believed that the civil rights movement should be bloody, not peaceful. He even replied to King's "I Have a Dream" speech with, "The black masses in America were and still are having a nightmare." Malcolm X became the chief recruiter for the Black Muslims, and he was the target of white fears. In 1 year, Black Muslims increased from 12,000 members to 100,000 members. After numerous years as part of the Black Muslims, X decided to leave due to his beliefs that not enough was being done by the Black Muslims. He proceeded to travel to Africa and decided it was not the white people's fault for being evil, that they were just raised that way. The U.S. government began to see X as a threat. Whenever he made his human rights trip to Africa, the CIA ordered agents to monitor his actions. After his trip to Africa, X had a new goal. He formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity, or the OAU, which believed that racism, not the white race, was the African Americans' biggest enemy. It was during one of his speeches for his newly found organization that he was assassinated. Malcolm was assassinated on February 21st, 1965, while somebody was distracting the crowd just long enough for two men to walk up and shoot Malcolm X at point-blank range. Strangely enough, all of the other speakers that night had canceled at the last moment, leaving Malcolm to carry the evening. It seems clear that nothing may have been able to save him, but Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, one of the finest medical institutions in the city, did not respond to his request for help, despite being right across the street from where Malcolm was killed. People mourned at this news. Another civil rights leader was murdered for their radical beliefs. As most assassinations go, there's usually a conspiracy to go along with it. One of X's own bodyguards was an agent for BOSSI, a New York City. In the end, Malcolm's own aides had to go across the street, bring over a stretcher, and then wheel him back over before they received any help at all. He was assassinated by the members of the Nation of Islam, the group that he used to dedicate his life to. 3 members took the blame for the assassination: Talmadge Hayer, Norman Butler, and Thomas Johnson, all members that were convicted of first-degree murder on March 10, 1966. As a final footnote, one of Malcolm's top aides went to the FBI about 10 days after the assassination and told him that he felt there was a larger conspiracy, incorporating elements of the United States government involved in Malcolm's death. He was found dead a few days later at the age of 32 in his Boston apartment. Martin Luther King Jr. was born January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. At age 15, King entered Morehouse College in Atlanta to further his education. At Morehouse, King favored studies in medicine and law, but these were eclipsed in his senior year by a decision to enter the ministry, as his father did. He spent the next 3 years at Crosser Theological Seminary School in Chester, Pennsylvania, where he became acquainted with Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence. He then pursued his career in ministry in Montgomery, Alabama. He then became the pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. About a year later, Montgomery's small group of civil rights advocates decided to contest racial segregation on the city's public bus system. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks, an African-American woman, had refused to surrender her bus seat to a white passenger, and as consequence was arrested for violating the city's segregation law. Activists formed the Montgomery Improvement Association to boycott the transit system and chose King as their leader. He had the advantage of being a young, well-trained man who was too new in town to have any enemies. He was generally respected, and it was thought that his family connections and professional standing would enable him to find another pastorate should the boycott fail. A year after the boycott started, it was resolved, and the African Americans got the justice they were looking for. But King realized that it wasn't only in Alabama that this was happening. He realized that there was a need for a movement like this in other cities around Alabama and in other states in the South. King organized the SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which gave him a base of operation throughout the South, as well as a national platform from which to speak. In the years from 1960 to 1965, King's influence reached its peak. He was handsome, eloquent, and determined. He quickly caught the attention of the media. He understood the power of the television, and he knew that it would help nationalize the struggle for civil rights. King had support from the administration of Presidents Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. King joined with other civil rights leaders in organizing the historic March on Washington on August 28, 1963. It was an interracial assembly of more than 200,000 people who gathered peacefully in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial to demand equal justice for all citizens under the law. It was there where crowds were uplifted by the emotional strength and prophetic quality of King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, in which he emphasized his faith that all men someday would be brothers. The first signs of opposition to King's tactics from within the civil rights movement surfaced during the March 1995 demonstrations in Selma, Alabama, which were aimed at dramatizing the need for a federal voting rights law that would provide legal support for the enfranchisement of African Americans in the South. He headed a procession of 1,500 marchers, black and white. He set out across the Pettus Bridge outside Selma until the group came to a barricade of state troopers. But instead of going on and forcing a confrontation, he led his followers to kneel in prayer and then unexpectedly turned back. Malcolm X went so far as to call King's tactics criminal. Concerning nonviolence, it is criminal to teach a man not to defend himself when he is the constant victim of brutal attacks. Meanwhile, the strain and changing dynamics of the civil rights movement had taken a toll on King, especially in the final months of his life. "I'm frankly tired of marching. I'm tired of going to jail," he admitted in 1968. "Living every day under the threat of death, I feel discouraged every now and then and feel my works in vain, but then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again." It was in some people's opinion that King knew his life would be cut short and that he knew that he could die any day. It was not until April 4th, 1968 that King's predictions came true.
China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Direct from our newsroom in Washington, in color, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Russ Hodge in Memphis, Tennessee, Dan Rather in New York, Bernard Kalb in Saigon, Marvin Kalb in Wellington, New Zealand, and Bert Quint in Quezon, South Vietnam.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene. Officers also reportedly chased and fired on a radio-equipped car containing 2 white men. Dr. King was standing on the balcony of a second-floor hotel room tonight when, according to a companion, a shot was fired from across the street. In the friend's words, the bullet exploded in his face. Police, who have been keeping a close watch over the Nobel Peace Prize winner because of Memphis' turbulent racial situation, were on the scene almost immediately. They rushed the 39-year-old Negro leader to a hospital where he died of a bullet wound in the neck. Police said they found a high-powered hunting rifle about a block from the hotel, but it was not immediately identified as the murder weapon. Mayor Henry Loeb has reinstated the dusk-to-dawn curfew he imposed on the city last week when a march led by Dr. King erupted in violence. Governor Buford Ellington has called out 4,000 National Guardsmen, and police report that the murder has touched off sporadic acts of violence in a Negro section of the city. In a nationwide television address, President Johnson expressed the nation's shock.
America is shocked and saddened by the brutal slaying tonight of Dr. Martin Luther King. I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King, who lived by nonviolence.
Dr. King had returned to Memphis only yesterday, determined to prove that he could lead a peaceful mass march in support of striking sanitation workers, most of whom are Negro.
Earlier that morning, King's anti-protesting restraining order had been lifted by a district judge, and he was preparing to visit an old friend for dinner. While preparing to leave, Martin was shot at approximately 6 p.m. in the face with a high-powered rifle while on the balcony outside of his hotel room in the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. He was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. The whole nation was outraged by his death, and racial violence erupted in more than 120 cities. It was during these riots that 46 people died and 3,000 were injured, and more than 20,000 people were arrested. King's funeral was held on the 9th of April in Atlanta. Thousands of people blocked the streets outside, while millions watched the funeral on TV. 2 mules had pulled his coffin 4 miles with more than 100,000 followers. James Earl Ray was put on FBI's most wanted list. He acquired a bogus Canadian passport, 4 sets of phony identification, money, and tickets to Europe after King was shot. James Earl Ray was arrested for his murder on June 8th in London. Ray pled guilty and accepted a 99-year jail sentence without trial. 3 days later, he recanted and asked for a trial, claiming that he had been framed. Ray later recanted his confession, claiming that lawyers had coerced him into confessing and that he was the victim of a conspiracy. In a surprising turn of events, members of King's family eventually came to Ray's defense. King's son Dexter met with the reputed assassin in March of 1997, and then publicly joined Ray's plea for the reopening of his case. People could believe it was a conspiracy because there were multiple different aspects that pointed towards someone else committing this heinous act. One of which being that a man, claiming to work for King, went to the hotel that King would be staying at and requested a room with a balcony. Then, slightly before the murder, King's security was reduced from 8 men to only 2. Ray claimed to be framed and that there was a different assassin that he was taking the fall for. 3 branches obstructed Ray's alleged view, so, therefore, if Ray would have shot him on the spot, his shot was unrealistically good. On top of that, there were 2 witnesses that claimed that it was not Ray who was running from the building where the shot came. One of these witnesses was later illegally put into a mental institution and her records were removed from the hospital. Although the U.S. government conducted several investigations into the murder of King and each time concluded that Ray was the sole assassin, the killing remains a matter of controversy.
Just as I have a dream, my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. We will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, glory, glory, glory. Oh, glory, glory. One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, glory, glory, glory. Oh, now the war